Hi, science buddies! I am teacher Jaja, your teacher for today's Science at Home class. Come and join me and let's explore the wonderful world of science because science is fun. Are you ready? Great! So bring out the inner scientist in you and together we're going to explore the wonderful world of science. Before we start our discussion, please get your science module number 1 entitled Does It Matter? Science notebook and ballpen ready. This visual lesson will focus on Lesson 2, Material that Float and Sink. At the end of this visual lesson, you are expected to describe the kinds of material that float and sink, and classify materials based on their ability to float and sink. Let's see what you already know about our lesson. We have here different kinds of materials. If we are going to put these materials on a basin of water, which do you think will float and which will sink? Okay, we have here a bowl. If we're going to put this bowl in water, what do you think will happen to it? Will it float or will it sink? Very good. The ball will float in water. What about this styrofoam block? If we're going to put this foam or styrofoam in water, what do you think will happen to it? Will it float or will it sink? Very good. The styrofoam will float in water. What about the stone? Will it float or will it sink? Yes, you're absolutely right. The stones will sink in water. What about this metal spoon? What do you think will happen to it? We're going to put it in water. Will it float or will it sink? Yes, you're right. This metal spoon will sink in water. What about this toy boat? If we're going to put this toy boat in water, what do you think will happen to it? Will it float or will it sink? Very good. So this toy boat will float in water. Did you classify all the materials correctly? Very good. If not, don't worry, because for today, we're going to discover what makes an object float and what makes it sink. Are you ready? Okay, let's continue. In our previous visual lesson, you learned the properties of materials that absorb water. So in this lesson, you will discover the properties of the materials that float and sink in water. Are you ready? Okay, let's do this activity. What's in? So look at the following pictures. Which of these will float or sink in water? Are you ready? Okay, number 1, log. What do you think will happen to the log when put in water? Will it float or will it sink? Very good. The log will float in water. What about the apple? Will it float or will it sink? Yes, you're right. The apple will float in water. What about the duck? Will it float or will it sink? Yes, the duck will float in water. What about a floater or a salvavidas? Will it float or will it sink in water? Yes, you're right. Floaters or salvavidas will float in water. That's why when we go swimming, we are using a salvavidas or a floater so that we don't drown, right? Okay, very good. Number 5, key or a metal key. What do you think will happen to the metal key we'll put in water? Will it float or will it sink? Yes, the key will sink in water. What about a magnet? What do you think will happen to the magnet when put in water? Will it float or will it sink? Yes, very good. The magnet will sink in water. So what makes these materials float in water while the other sinks? Let's find out. To discover why materials float or sink in water, let's do this activity entitled Floating, Sinking. But before doing any activity, be careful in handling materials for your safety. Make sure that you have your parents to guide you in doing this activity. Are you ready? Okay, let's begin. So what are we going to do? Number 1, you need to gather all the materials needed for the activity. Number 2, measure 1 liter of water and put water into the pail or basin. Number 3, put the materials one by one into the pail or basin of water. Number 4, observe what happens. Observe carefully. Number 5, check if the materials float in water or put an X mark if it sinks. Okay, let's continue. Now, let us observe which material will float or sink. Now that we are done doing the activity, floating, sinking, let's complete this table. Based on your observation, what happened to the rubber ball when we put it in the basin of water? Does it float or sink? Very good. The rubber ball floats in water. What about the styrofoam? Does it float or sink? Yes, the styrofoam floats in water. What about the stone? When we put the stone in the basin of water, what happened to it? Does it float or sink? Yes, the stone sunk when we put it in the basin of water. What about the metal spoon? Does it float or sink? Yes, the metal spoon sunk when we put it in the basin of water. What about the pencil? Does it float or does it sink? Yes, the pencil floats in water. Now that we are done identifying the materials that float and sink in water, let's answer the following question. First question. Which of the materials floated in water? Correct. Based on our activity, the rubber ball, the styrofoam, and the pencil floated in water. Next question. Which of the materials sank in water? Correct. The materials that sank were the stones and the metal spoon. Next question. Does the weight of an object affect its ability to float? What do you think? Yes, you're right. The weight of an object doesn't affect its ability to float or sink. For example, a plastic spoon is light, but it sinks in water. A boat is heavy, yet it floats. So, the weight of an object doesn't affect its ability to float. Okay, next question. What makes some of the materials float in water? What do you think? Is it the weight of the object? Is it the shape? The material it is made of? Let's find out the answer for this question as we go along our lesson. Let's go! I have here two kinds of ball, a basketball and a bowling ball. If we put this ball in water, which will float and which will sink? What do you think? Very good. The basketball will float in water. So what is float? Float means to stay above the surface of the water. I repeat, float means to stay above the surface of the water. What about the bowling ball? Will it float or will it sink? Very good. The bowling ball will sink in water. So what do we mean by sink? Yes, you're right. Sink means to go below the surface of the water. So float above the surface of the water and sink below the surface of the water. What causes objects to sink and float? Whether an object sinks or floats depends on its density. Do you know what density means? Density is the degree of compactness of an object. Everything around us is made of tiny molecules. Molecules are tiny particles that can be seen with a microscope. In some objects, the molecules are jam-packed together, and in others, they are loosely packed together. This picture illustrates the amount of molecules in solid, liquids, and gas. As you can see, the particles in the solids are touching with very little space between them. These particles in a liquid usually are still touching, but there are some spaces between them. Whereas the gas have big distances between them. So solids are denser than liquid, which are denser than gas. This picture illustrates the amount of molecules in an object. Object A have a tightly packed molecule, whereas Object B have a loosely packed molecules. As we learned in our previous slide, density is the degree of compactness of an object. So which do you think is denser? Is it Object A or Object B? Very good. Object A contains more molecules than Object B, which means Object A is denser than Object B. So, Object A will sink in water, whereas Object B will float. Whether an object sinks or floats depends on its density. Let's look at this illustration. Objects with tightly packed molecules will sink if it is denser than the liquid it is immersed in. So, ibig sabihin, pag compact or pag mas marami yung molecules ng isang solid kaysa dun sa molecules ng liquid, it will sink. As you can see in this illustration, the molecules of the bowling ball is tightly packed. Usually, objects that are jam-packed together have a higher density, which means when placed in water, it will sink, because the object is denser than the water. Remember, if something is denser than the water, it will sink. We have learned that when something is denser than the water, it will sink. So what makes an object float? Very good. Objects with loosely packed molecules will float if it is less dense than the liquid it is placed in. So ibig sabihin, mas konti yung molecules ng object kaysa sa water natin. So pag nangyari yon, what will happen to the object? It will float. An object floats when it has air inside it. Since a basketball is full of air, it will float. Why? Because air is less dense than water. Remember, an object floats when it has air inside it. An object sinks when it has no air inside it. Why? Because air is less dense than water. We have learned that density is the degree of compactness of an object. It refers to how tightly packed or loosely packed an object is. So, if an object is less dense than the liquid, it will float. That's why a material that has gas will float in liquid. We have learned that weight doesn't affect an object's ability to float, but how less dense something is. What about the shape of an object? Does the shape of an object affect its ability to float? Let's find out. Upthrust is the force that pushes an object up and makes it seem to lose weight in a liquid. It is a push that always goes straight up against the direction of gravity. Upthrust is the force which is responsible in making an object float or sink in a liquid. Changing the object's shape will also make its ability to float, because it holds air and upthrust has more space to push the object. When you shape a clay into a ball, it will sink. Why? Because there is no air inside it, and the molecules of the clay ball is denser than the water. But if you mold the clay into a boat-like shape, there will be space for the air to occupy into the clay boat. As we have learned, air is less dense than water. That's why it will float. Look at how my previous learners shaped their clay to make it float. Try this fun activity at home and send me a picture if you make the clay float. These are the factors affecting sinking or floating of objects: density or compactness of an object, air inside an object, and the shape or form of an object. Now let's do this activity. Let's see what you have learned. What are you going to do? You're going to fill in the missing words to make the sentence correct. Are you ready? Very good. Sink means to fall at the blank of water, while blank means to stay on top. What is your answer? Correct. Sink means to fall at the bottom of water, while float means to stay on top. Next, materials like styrofoam, wood, and cork can blank in water, while materials like coin, ring, key, chalk, metal spoon, and large stone can blank in water. What is your answer? Very good. Materials like styrofoam, wood, and cork can float in water, while materials like coin, ring, key, chalk, metal spoon, and large stone can sink in water. An object's weight can affect its ability to float, but some materials float no matter what their blank or blank, such as styrofoam and balsa wood. What is the answer? Very good. An object's weight can affect its ability to float, but some materials float no matter what their weight or size, such as styrofoam and balsa wood. There are different materials in our environment that can be classified according to their properties. They can be classified based on their ability to blank and blank. What is your answer? Correct. There are different materials in our environment that can be classified according to their properties. They can be classified based on their ability to float and sink. Very good, guys. Okay, let us see if you learned something from our lesson. What you're going to do, you're going to write fact if the statement is correct and bluff if it is false. Are you ready? Okay. 1. Metal spoon floats in water. Is it a fact or a bluff? Very good. So the answer is bluff because metal spoon sinks in water. Number 2. Pencil floats in water. Is it a fact or a bluff? Correct. Pencil floats in water. That's why the answer is a fact. Number 3. Stapler sinks in water. Is this statement correct? What's your answer? Is it a fact or a bluff? Correct. Stapler sinks in water, so the statement is a fact. Number 4. Coins sink in water. Is this statement correct? Yes, so the answer is fact. Number 5. Chalk floats in water. Is this statement correct? No, the answer is bluff because chalk sinks in water because chalk absorbs water. That's why it will sink. Number 6. Plastic toy boat floats in water. Is this a fact or a bluff? Correct. So the answer is fact. Number 7. Thumbtacks float in water. Is it a fact or a bluff? Correct. The answer is bluff because thumbtacks sinks in water. Number 8. Ping pong ball sinks in water. Is this statement correct? No. So the answer is bluff because ping pong ball floats in water because ping pong ball contains air inside it, right? Okay, number 9. Plastic saucer floats in water. What is your answer? Okay, on this part, it can be a fact or a bluff because it depends on its initial position. So if you're going to put it in the water face down, it will sink immediately. But if it's face up, as long as there will be no water inside the saucer, it will float. Okay, number 10, nail sinks in water. Is it a fact or bluff? So the answer is fact. Okay, very good. Let's do this next activity. Read each question carefully. Write the letter of your answer on your science notebook. Number 1. An object should float in a liquid if it is A. Heavy, B. Lighter than metal, C. Shaped like a ball, or letter D. Less dense than the liquid. What is your answer? Very good. An object should float in a liquid if it is less dense than the liquid. So the answer is letter D. Number 2. A tiny piece of sand is very light but sinks in water. This is because A. Sand is heavy, B. Sand is a solid, C. Sand is denser than water, or letter D. There is more water than sand. What is your answer? Very good. The answer is C. Sand is denser than water. Number 3. A candle floats in water but sinks in alcohol. This is because A. Water is lighter than alcohol, B. Water is heavier than alcohol, C. The candle is lighter than the alcohol, or letter D. Water and alcohol are both liquids. What is your answer? Very good. The answer is B. Water is heavier than alcohol. So, liquids, the water and alcohol are liquids, right? So, liquids have different density. Number 4. A carrot floats in salt water but sinks in fresh water. This is because A. The carrot is lighter than salt water, B. Fresh water is heavier than salt water, C. Salt water is heavier than fresh water, or letter D. A large piece of carrot has a different density. What is your answer? Very good. So the answer is B. Fresh water is heavier than salt water, or fresh water is denser than salt water. Next, number 5. Which of the following materials will float in water? Is it A. Coin, B. Stone, C. Balloon, or letter D. Iron nail? What is your answer? Okay, very good. So the answer is C. Balloon. The coins, stone, and iron nail will sink in water while balloon will float in water because the balloon contains air and air is less dense than the water. Very good. Today, we have learned that density affects an object's ability to float. If an object is denser than the water, it will sink. But if the object is less dense than the water, it will float. The shape and presence of air inside an object affects its ability to float because air is less dense than the water. That's it for now, guys. Once again, I am Teacher Jaja, your awesome science teacher. Join me again next time in exploring the wonderful world of science because science is fun. Bye!